Thank you. I'm delighted to have been invited here by Jim and the Noor Foundation, and that they actually named the conference after my book, Common Morality, which is an abbreviation of this really big book, which I abbreviated because my children said nobody would read this big book. So, in case I don't answer all the questions that you might have, and you think you have any objections, then you can always pick up the books and they will give you the answers. Also, by showing you, notice I don't show you this is how old-fashioned I am. I show you the actual book. I don't have it on the screen. That's because I'm a philosopher. And I also want to show you that by advertising my book, there is no conflict necessary between self-interest and morality. So you see that. Okay, now let me see. Now, other people are telling you how you find out the various answers and stuff like that. And I'm very different. I simply give you the answers. So I'm talking about, this is not about morality. This is about those things that everybody takes to be harms and those things they take to be benefits or goods. And I'm just claiming, and this is where you can object, everybody agrees to these. There's nothing controversial about those things at all. If we're doing a cost-benefit analysis, nobody wonders whether this belongs on these things. I have one of these even. No, it's the wrong way. It shows you how much I know how to do this. Is that right? Am I showing anything? Yes, I am. Does this? No, that's the way. This thing. Look at that. There. See, nobody's going to think those belong on the benefit side or that these belong on the harm side. So everybody agrees to that. I mean, philosophers, by the way, we don't know anything that anybody else doesn't know because we don't do any research. So everything I tell you is something you already know. So that I take it, none of that's surprising. There is no real debate about that. Now, what there is debate about is how do we rank the various harms and the various evils. As a matter of fact, everything except death, there's degrees of severity. That is, pain, disability, loss of freedom. There's different amounts. So and even death occurs at different ages. So it's ranked differently. So there is no. Though they're listed in that way, there is no ranking of one of them's better than the other or worse than the other, and the same thing goes on the other side. So there is no unique rational ranking of the harms or benefits, and all of the controversy that we have is about the ranking, the difference we have in the rankings of the harms or the benefits, and whether a given benefit will compensate for a harm. All of that disagreement, all of that disagreement is completely compatible with there being no disagreement at all about what counts as a harm and what counts as a benefit. That's interesting. Now, insofar, I think we go to the next one. Good. Insofar as we're acting rationally, insofar as we all want to avoid the harms for ourselves. That is, it's irrational, crazy, not to avoid the harms for yourself unless you have some reason. If somebody says, well, I just feel like, heads I'll wear my yellow tie and tails I'll cut off my arm. Comes up tails, guess I have to cut off my arm. That's crazy. Nobody does that unless they are crazy. So it's irrational. It's irrational not to avoid the harms unless you've got some reason for yourself. It is now not, in a sense, not irrational not to seek the goods. It's contra Aristotle. You don't have to seek the goods. If somebody says, "Look, there's a really funny movie, that you would enjoy. Why don't you go to it?" And the guy says, "I don't feel like it." That's it. Nothing irrational about that. Even clear case, somebody says, "Look, why don't you go to the gym and improve your abilities?" And the guy says, "Nah, I'm good enough." So nothing irrational about that. I'm all in favor of sloth myself. So So it turns out there's a somewhat of a difference. Evils, in fact, have much more motivational force than goods, and they ought to. That is, we all think we ought to avoid the evils. We don't think we need to seek the goods, but it would be irrational to avoid the goods for no reason. If somebody's going to just give you these things with no strings attached at all, etc., then it would be irrational to avoid it, unless, of course, you didn't believe them. It turns out now, unfortunately, that you don't need any reasons if you're not going to harm yourself. If you're not harming yourself, you don't need any reasons for doing what you're doing. And that has a disconcerting conclusion. Namely, vandals who just go around destroying things of other people, they're not acting irrationally. They just feel like trashing somebody's stuff. As long as they make sure they're not going to get caught, nothing irrational about what they're doing. And when we talk about it's irrational to do something unless you have an adequate reason, notice the phrase adequate reason doesn't even make any sense unless you're doing something irrational. That is, an adequate reason is a reason that makes an otherwise irrational action rational. So if you're not doing anything irrational, you're not harming yourself, you don't even need any reasons for doing it. So we don't need any reasons for doing most of the stuff we do. Though, of course, we can have that. Now, the fact that it's perfectly vandals, if they're careful, can be acting rationally, shows that by rational, I have not hidden any moral content inside the concept of rational. Philosophers always want to make sure they're not begging questions and things like that. Okay, now here, if I say without an adequate reason, then I've got to tell you what an adequate reason is. Well, before I can tell you what an adequate reason is, I've got to tell you what a reason is. And there it is. A reason for acting as a benefit is a belief that one's actions will avoid a harm or gain a benefit for someone. And now that's interesting. Because it turns out that's different from what it is to be irrational. To be irrational is to act in a way that will harm yourself without an adequate reason. But a reason is a belief that your action will help anyone. So you can, in fact, be rational and sacrifice yourself for somebody else. That is to avoid some harm for somebody else. So it's not irrational now to harm yourself if you're thereby helping somebody else avoid harm. But it's not irrational not to avoid a harm for somebody else. That is, rationality does not require you to be concerned with others, but it allows that. It's perfectly rational to be concerned with others. So again, rationality allows that. And in fact, a lot of people, and people have talked about emotions and this and that, all interesting stuff, that may explain why people do help others and don't help others. But sometimes people, for various kinds of reasons, they don't feel like helping others. Sometimes they do. Maybe if you tell them the right story. But it turns out many people turn down giving even to really good charities because they don't feel like being bothered. But other people do, in fact, do lots of things to help others. They even sacrifice a lot of them themselves. So we get people, and everybody said that because it would be stupid to deny it. Some people act very, very morally, and some people act immorally. I don't even think you need neuroscience to find that out. I mean, it's quite clear. Everybody knows that. Because if I know it, everybody knows it. Because I don't know anything that other people don't know. Okay, so now we talk about an adequate reason. Now, what's an adequate reason? Well, an adequate reason is just what I said. It's a belief that the harm avoided or the benefit gained is adequate to make what would otherwise be an irrational action rational. So So it's the case that if I'm going to harm myself, then it's got to be the case that I'm benefiting somebody, at least to the degree that it makes it sensible for me to harm myself. So, and it turns out that, as a matter of fact, if the reason's strong enough, it can make really causing yourself great harm, in fact, even doing something that's going to cause you to die, perfectly rational. And in fact, soldiers often sacrifice their lives to save their buddies. And they're considered to be acting heroically, not irrationally. And we talked about 9/11. In fact, I started this book, the Common Morality book, because of 9/11. I was at the National Humanities Center, and I was going to be writing a book on Hobbes, and then 9/11 happened, and I said, no, with an absolute stupid view that it was going to make a difference, I'm going to write this book that really will tell people how that ought to behave. Okay, in any event, it turns out that firemen now, they often risk their lives to save people they don't even know. And that's perfectly rational. We know, again, we think they're behaving rationally. Now notice, it is the case that the only thing that counts as a reason is that you're going to be benefiting somebody. It's not a reason for doing something that you're going to harm somebody. A reason must involve avoiding a harm or gaining a good for somebody. That somebody will be harmed is not a reason. Now, it should be clear that by reason, I don't mean a motive, that which motivates you to act, because people are sometimes motivated to act by revenge or hatred or whatever. But those motives are not reasons. They don't make it rational for me to do something that would otherwise be irrational. Now, a person who harms somebody else who's not going to harm himself and not going to harm himself, that's perfectly rational to do. I haven't said anything that. But if a guy harms himself to harm somebody else, that's crazy. If a guy goes up into an airplane with an enemy and he says, aha, I got you up here. And the guy says, well, what can you do with me up here? He says, I'm going to crash. And he says, but if you crash, you'll die too. The guy says, so what? I mean, that is nuts. I mean, so doing something, though you could be motivated to do it, to harm somebody, even though you're going to harm yourself, that is crazy. Now, the question is, but what is an adequate reason? That is, how are you going to weigh the cost and the benefits? And that's going to be difficult to discover because, as I pointed out, people rank the goods and the harms differently. So what will be an adequate reason to one person won't be an adequate reason to somebody else. So the question is, what is an adequate reason? And now note that doesn't even have to be interpersonal. It could be intra. That is, at the end of life, I do a lot of work in medical ethics, some people decide that they want to forego life-prolonging treatment. They don't think that the pain and suffering is worth it. So they don't think that the pain and they think the pain and suffering, avoiding the pain and suffering, is an adequate reason for dying earlier. Other people don't think that's an adequate reason. That is, they won't do it. They don't want to do it. Now, which one of them is right? And the answer is they both are. As the rabbi said, when one says, you both are. Okay, so it is the case that I follow actually the legal and medical practice that whatever a competent patient regards as an adequate reason is an adequate reason. So I don't want to call anything irrational unless there's no doubt about it. I'm a very moderate dogmatist. So that is, I'm saying all this stuff is absolutely true, so I don't want to say anything controversial, I hope. I don't think I've said anything controversial yet. I hope. Okay, so what I'm saying is anybody thinks it's an adequate reason is an adequate reason, and the reason I don't want to call anything irrational unless everybody agrees that it's irrational, is to say that something's irrational is a very serious thing to say. And it is used by people to overrule other people's decisions. If somebody makes an irrational decision, then you think you've got an adequate reason to overrule them. Now, we're finally going to get to morality. And I'm going to tell you what morality is. Everybody else says they can't tell you what it is. Here's a nice abbreviated version of what it is. You want a fuller version, you have to look at the books. It's an informal public system applying to all moral agents that has the goal of lessening of harm suffered by those who are protected by the system as its goal. That's what morality is. Wow, that's amazing. Now you got answers. I mean, you're not getting the things these other people do, ways to get the answer. Here is the answer. Okay. Okay, now, some important points before I explain fully what I said up there. Morality evolved among and for, so I do a little evolution, but nothing that everybody doesn't already know. Vulnerable, fallible, biased beings. If people could not suffer any harms, there would be no need for morality, would never have developed. If people were always impartial and omniscient, there would be no need for a moral system. They could simply do what would have the best consequences for all involved. If there were agreement on what counted as the best consequences, which of course there isn't, as I've already pointed out, because they rank it. But human beings are vulnerable, fallible, and biased. Sorry. So there's a need for a moral system that governs the way they behave. Now, many philosophers, in fact, most, I think, and even lots of people who are not philosophers, tend to think of morality as the system they adopt to govern their own behavior toward others. This way of thinking is very unlikely to result in a common morality. However, if we think of morality as the system that people publicly put forward to govern the behavior of everybody else that they're going to interact with, even if they don't plan to follow it themselves, then insofar as people are rational, they'll all put forward a common morality. So morality is not the system we adopt for ourselves, it's the one we want everybody else to follow. And that explains why morality is so closely connected with hypocrisy. I mean, even if people don't plan, even if they put forward the public system, even if they don't plan to act on it, though of course some do plan to act on it, but even if they don't, they're all gonna put forward the same moral system. All people want this common morality to be taught in schools, their religions will endorse this morality, and their legal system will enforce it. That's all that's going to happen. Insofar as morality can be derived from evolution, this is the way it happened. And it happens then that the children will be taught what morality is and why they should follow it. So it may even seem that acting morally is built into human nature, which of course it may be in part. Take children's adult attitudes toward bodily waste products and children's attitudes. Very different. Okay, now one result of this way of thinking makes it clear why morality or the moral system is like the grammar of our language. That is, almost nobody can explicitly state the grammar, but everybody understands it in the sense that they use it when they talk and when they understand the speech of others. In the same way, everybody knows what morality is, even though most people can't state the features of it. All normal adults know it. Even those who act immorally, know that they're acting immorally, but for them, self-interest or interest of their family, friends, country, or religion provide stronger motives than for acting morally. Now, some people are confused about morality, maybe more after you hear this talk. This view was suggested by some of my remarks about rationality, that you might think that self-interest is the enemy of morality. But I tried to show you it wasn't, because advertising my book. That was not immoral. Okay, thus many rational people think that if they're acting against their own self-interest and for the interests of others, they must be acting morally. That's completely false. far more harm is caused by altruistic immorality than by immorality due to self-interest. Think of the wars fought by people in support of their country, race, or religion when those entities are doing immoral things. That is, the countries waging immoral wars, religions promulgating inquisitions, etc., and people supporting them. Far more immorality that's done altruistically than self-interest. And so that's one thing you don't want to equate, altruism and morality. Now, on a more personal level, as we saw, some parents care so much about their kids, they'd be prepared to do immoral things for their kids when they'd never be prepared to do it for themselves. That is quite common. And it is the case that many professionals, doctors, lawyers, scientists, act immorally to protect the immoral behavior of their colleagues when they would never act immorally for their own self-interest. Now, of course, some professionals, like all other people, act immorally for their own self-interest. The former are confused, the latter are hypocrites. Hypocrisy, which some people take as showing morality is not universal, actually shows the opposite. Hypocrites have to know what morality prohibits, requires, etc., in order to pretend. So that's what's going on. Now, okay, what have I got? Oh, yeah. So, well, let's see. I think in the interest of time and to give you lots of time to ask questions of me, because I love questions, I'm going to go on to the next. Here are the 10 moral rules. See, I'm giving you the answers. I mean, not like these. There they are. Those are the first 5, and those are second 5. If I did it right, there'd be a little tablets, and you'd see the top of 5 on one side and 1. Now, there may be other formulations. I don't say this is the only possible formulation, but I like this one because it's in accord with my tradition. And there's, the nice 10 rules, 2 tablets of 5 each. And I would think, now, that none of these rules are going to be surprising to anybody. Somebody says, God, I didn't know that you weren't allowed to disable people. Woo! I mean, that would be weird. I mean, so there's nothing in those rules that is the slightest bit surprising, which is, of course, true because, I'm a philosopher and I don't know anything you don't know. So there they are. Now, you'll notice, by the way, that the first 5 rules, there's a non-accidental coincidence between what those first 5 rules prohibit and the 5 harms I talked about at the beginning. That is, this talk was organized. It is the case that the first 5 rules say nobody wants those, and the first 5 rules say don't cause them. Okay? The second 5 rules, as a matter of fact, very little sociology you have to know, is to know that by and large, when you violate these rules, that's going to increase the probability of people suffering the harms, and the more of those rules are violated in any society, the more harm is going to be suffered. That's a little piece of extra information that's not completely obvious, but I would have thought, if I know it, you know it. So now, it's the second 5 rules, by the way, that have this characteristic that sometimes when you violate them, that nobody's harmed. Sometimes nobody's harmed, or at least that you can see. And that's why well-intentioned people sometimes ask, usually of the second 5, why should I be moral? And that's why it's important to realize that morality is for fallible, biased beings. Failure to realize that is responsible for some of the weird views that philosophers have put forward. Take utilitarianism, or act utilitarianism. I mention this view because it's a view that initially sounds very plausible, and lots of people who claim they don't hold any moral theory actually hold that theory. That is, it is the case that morality, is not for impartial, omniscient beings. Taking act utilitarianism as a moral guide would require people to do what they regard as having the best overall consequences. That is, the best combination of less harm and more good than any other act. Of course, people are going to differ as to what they count as having the best consequences. But on this view, moral rules, these things, have no significance. So people should just act to produce the best consequences. And whether they're deceiving, breaking a promise, cheating, etc., that doesn't make any difference. Just imagine what life would be like if everybody actually followed that. It would be disastrous. If nobody thought the rules were of any significance and each person decided on his own, in each case, what would be the best consequences? Woo! The best and the brightest. Okay. Now, that we regard the rules as important, now, is shown by the fact, and now this relates to the previous talk, is that we have common moral virtues that are related to each of the second 5 rules. There are no virtues related to the first 5 rules because you don't need them. Everybody's just expected to obey the first 5 rules. But for the second 5 rules, we have, truthful, trustworthy, fair, etc. So, though it's important to use these rules as moral guides, now, it would be disastrous to regard them as absolute. That is to say, it's always morally wrong to break them. That goes even for the first 5. Now, how is one to decide when to violate a moral rule? See, I tell you everything. I mean, I don't hold anything back. Here's how you decide. Now, some people think that you should break a moral rule whenever it would have the best consequences. But we already said that would be disaster, given that people are fallible, biased, etc. It would also be disastrous to follow Kant and say one should not lie to a hired killer in order to save an innocent life, because it's lying, and you couldn't will that to be a universal law. Couldn't will everybody lie. So what? That is, to be justified, it's not the case that you have to be willing for everybody that you want everybody to act that way. It's that you can violate a moral rule when you'd be willing for everyone to know that they can break the rule in the same circumstances. And you would be willing for everybody to know they can lie to a hired killer in order to save an innocent life. That's quite clear. So it turns out, if you follow this, it is this wonderful Aristotelian middle ground between the deontologists and the utilitarians. It takes into account consequences, but not the consequences of the particular act, but the consequences of what would be the case if everybody knew they could violate the rule in those circumstances. And it gives you the impartiality that you're required to have. The opposite of impartiality is arrogance, thinking it's all right for you to do something, but you certainly wouldn't want the rest of the dummies to know they're allowed to break the rule in the same circumstances. Okay, move. These are the moral ideals. There's more to morality than the rules. These are the things that you should do in order to be morally good. If you obey the moral rules, you're just not being immoral. But if you want to be morally good, you got to do that. It's a little more complicated. You don't have to be impartial when you're following these. It would be absurd to say you have to give to every charity impartially. A penny to each? I mean, that's just dumb. So, general obedience to the moral rules is necessary for a society to survive. Significant following of the moral ideals is necessary for a society to flourish. Here are the moral virtues that go with the rules and the ideals, except the first one over there, kind, that goes really with the moral ideals. That is, that's not obeying the moral rules, that's following the moral ideals, helping people who are suffering and stuff like that. Cruelty is violating the first 5 rules intentionally. Callousness is violating them knowingly but not intentionally. And it's also not acting on the moral ideals when you have an opportunity to do that. So that's that. And now, here's the last slide, the moral disagreement. It is the case that I've already saw one of the big differences is the ranking of the harms and the benefits. So what some people think will be an adequate justification, they'd be willing for everybody to know they could do that for that. Some people will say yes, some people say no. So that's a disagreement that rational people have. You're not going to be able to solve it. The second is the interpretation of the moral rules. That's very important, by the way. What counts as killing? And you can say, well, killing, that's simple. It's causing somebody, doing something that causes somebody to be dead. Not true. Interesting. That is, suppose you are a patient in a hospital and you're on a ventilator and you don't want to be on the ventilator anymore. You're tired of being on the ventilator. You're terminal anyway, and you say, I refuse to be on it anymore. In every state in this country, the physician is required to take the person off the ventilator. That is not killing, even though they know that they're going to die when they take them off the ventilator. And the fact that it's not killing is shown by the fact that every state in this country, as a matter of fact, has laws against killing patients. You're not allowed to kill patients, even if they want you to. You're not even allowed to assist suicide in every state but 2, or maybe 3 now. And so taking them off the ventilator isn't even assisting suicide, because all the states, everybody allows it, and it's illegal. So that's the interpretation of the moral rule. And then you have simple ones, like somebody says, how are you? And you say, fine, how are you? If you're not fine, are you deceiving them? No. If you start telling them everything that's wrong with you, you're boorish. I mean, so that it just turns out you interpret the rules in a different way. And then who's fully protected by morality? Now that is the cause of the most serious controversy we now have. Our fetus is protected. Our animals fully protected. Some people think fetuses are protected from the moment of conception. Other people think not. And then finally, human nature. And human nature is, what do you think would be the consequence if everybody knew that they were allowed to break the rule? Optimists think, well, not much would happen, and pessimists think, oh yeah, it'd be pretty bad. And so those are the Democrats and Republicans. Okay, now, even though there is a common morality, it does not, this is my last slide. Even though there's Even though there's a common morality, it does not provide a unique correct answer to every moral question. Thus, in addition to common morality, we need a procedure that all can accept, that can decide the practical issue of how one ought to settle moral questions about which there is moral disagreement. Now, that's a political question, and luckily it goes beyond what I'm supposed to talk about.